it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's really exciting because I know you've heard from several of our friends in the community and also a couple other members of our team, Carrie Beer and Andy Allwine, on various projects we've done or very concepts that we apply to our work. So I'm uh, I'm the founder and co-owner of Passive to Positive. Um, which is part of our parent company, Indralogic. And we do primarily, at the moment, relatively large scale, affordable multifamily, all passive house or zero energy targeted. And as you can see on the screen here, some of it's new, some of it's small, some of it's big, some of it's retrofit, which is very interesting and challenging. So we may end up talking about that a little bit. Um, Anyway, we've been doing it since 2010, and that's not quite as long as Passive House has been around in the U.S., but it's it's much of that time. So we've been really excited to evolve our practice from that perspective. Um, so moving right along, I want to start on the bright side, which is to say that we have all the solutions we need to save community and planet. Um, Literally, we need no more technologies. We don't even need to use some that are being proposed. We have everything we need in a holistic, systemic manner to solve for climate change. Now, I'm going to hit that with a little bit of a caveat, which to say that our society, our socioeconomic system as we know it, does not recognize this graph, that there are limits. There are biogeophysical limits on planet Earth, and we have overshot our limits by 30% since 2080. And when you overshoot your carrying capacity, and I know this is a controversial topic, and there may be, and there should be a healthy debate about this, but from what I'm seeing in my research, we have overshot our carrying capacity by about 30% since 1980, and we are potentially on the precipice of a systems collapse. We see perpetual growth in every market, in every sector of every market, pretty much, unless it happens to be a market for the common good, like childcare or healthcare. We seem to be able to leverage capital to do unbelievably remarkable things and exponentially scale everything. But perhaps general human well-being equitably. I was living on Cape Cod when the transition was being made from diesel uh, diesel trawlers of a modest scale to factory trawlers, and the industrial sort of fishery was really taking off. And the market knew that there was no way you could keep going at this pace, but the increased scarcity and cost of fish leveraged the industry's ability to build out huge factory trawlers and scrape the last few fish from the ocean, which led to the Georges Bank fisheries collapse in 1992. And I saw the fishermen on the street. I knew them. And everyone in that situation knew that this was happening. But markets tend to accelerate towards the precipice. We are over our limits in any number of different categories. We are beyond the ecological carrying capacity of the planet, whether it be biosphere integrity, like habitat, chemical loading of the environment, climate change, obviously, biodiversity loss. All of these things are beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. And certain of them, like chemical contamination, are in all likelihood well beyond the limits of the carrying capacity of the planet, but they're not being regulated to the extent that we would then know that we were beyond the limits. They're not being observed. We don't have enough data, but it's certainly true. So my question when you asked us to speak at an event called Climate Tech, Aaron, was What is that? So I've always thought that the answer needs to be first, do no harm. So 44% of carbon emissions come from the building sector. 70% of the buildings, or 2/3 of the buildings that will be in use in 2050 are already in use. So we have to tackle buildings, and we have to tackle existing buildings in order to find our way out of climate change. We cannot build every building zero carbon or zero energy and think we're going to get there. We have to retrofit our cities too. It's a big job. But if we change our mindset from designing systems, excuse the barking, designing energy systems to match a wasteful building, to deciding what energy we're allowed to use and optimize the building to that, now that's a strategy that could actually help contain our impacts. So according to the 2000 Watt Society, which has been in operation for a long time, sort of measuring climate impacts, if you were to boil down your allowable energy and mine on a per household basis, energy for space conditioning, heating and cooling, it would be the equivalent of 16 candles or a hair dryer as your power source. That's it. And if you were to screw in 100 watt light bulbs and flick it on the day you're born, and then it turns off on the day you die, that's the power you get your entire life, and it has to include food systems, transport, education, everything. But housing is just 16 candles or a hairdryer. That's all you get. All right, so the thing is, we're walking around and working on projects like this. This is our first multifamily project in Washington, D.C. They're terrible for in terms of carbon emissions. They're terrible air quality. They're terribly uncomfortable. And because of all those things, they become less affordable because people have to burn a lot of fossil fuel to stay even remotely comfortable. And there are all kinds of indoor air quality impacts, and you know this well. I know this is part of your your main concern, is the way buildings have been built do not foster indoor air quality, partly because a lot of the things we don't see, the things behind the walls, could be growing mold the whole while. And this means that children have more asthma and are in the hospital more, and the parents have to take them and lose productivity and maybe lose their job. So if you look at this building we modeled before we added insulation, the back surface of the drywall was at dew point of interior air. So it was prime for growing mold. And it's, of course, terribly uncomfortable. So we really need to manage things. And when you talk about climate tech, one of the most profound climate techs available might just be a properly identified vapor control layer and thermal control layer. That could be a very, very simple thing. Once we retrofitted this building, or 3 buildings, but 1 project, the interior surface temperature of the wall and the cavity behind that finish wall was at about 67 degrees if you're heating to 68, which means you cannot possibly grow mold. So we've solved for comfort. The building is radically more comfortable. It uses dramatically less energy. It's near zero energy. And so it's more comfortable, it's using no energy or nearly no energy, and it's healthy. All right, so that's the sort of pitch for the conservation first approach to building envelopes and building retrofits. The problem is a lot of our industry said, all right, great, we need R value. And spray foam has a lot of R value. And so let's go. And they started coating the insides of historic buildings and new buildings with closed cell and open cell spray foam. But the problem with that is it's a high global warming potential material. And now they're saying, okay, well, we have zero ozone depletion and zero CO and a carbon dioxide equivalent of 1 in their blowing agents and the expansion agents, the chemicals that they use. But it's still a much higher carbon intensity product than any number of other products that I'll talk about in a moment. So the product is highly carcinogenic. There are neurotoxins um, and endocrine disruptors in these materials, but they have a high R value. So people say, okay, let's do the R value to reduce energy, and maybe they're thinking they're going to save us from climate change that way. But if you look at the chart down here in the center, XBF, which is the pink board or blue board foam, has a remarkably high global warming potential. So the more of it you use, the more you're setting yourself back. The same with closed cell spray foam. Natural materials tend to have very, very, very low carbon footprints if properly harvested and manufactured. So the concern that I had from the start was Passive House is great, conservation first is great, but we can't do it with a single focus of R value, or we could end up doing more harm than good. And what we see in this slide is that embodied carbon is the blue, or they're the blue bars, right? And its first day is the full stack of the blue bar in 2020. And then every year that stays the same because you've already spent it, right? That's just the embodied carbon of building the building, how much carbon it took to manufacture the materials, transport them to site, etc. And now if we say our climate change tipping point is sometime around 2040, and that line keeps moving forward in time, you can see that the operational energy, which is the gray bar, every year you add a little blip on top of that gray because it's cumulative over time. Well, by the climate change tipping point, the embodied carbon you spent on day one is 57% of the total carbon impact. So we can make that a zero energy building, and we've done nothing to control for climate change. Or not nothing. We haven't done enough. And because of this short time horizon, it ends up being meaningless because we're going over the precipice anyway. So embodied energy is really important. Also, I mentioned before that a lot of these foam high R value insulation products that people are using for efficiency, right, have incredibly high flame retardants, which are neurotoxins, endocrine disruptors, carcinogens. The foams themselves are also all those things. And so we end up in a situation where we're designing for efficiency and causing a health crisis and an ecological collapse. Then there's another climate tech idea. Let's electrify everything. All right, we're going to go all to heat pumps, and we're going to put all of our household equipment on the grid. And that, I want to be clear, is necessary. However, there's a new problem, and we have to think systemically and deeply about these things. Refrigerants are a leading cause of climate change. So the refrigerants in those heat pumps are, in some cases, several thousand times worse than burning fossil fuels in terms of climate change impact. And there are different time horizons, how long the molecules last in the atmosphere, and I, frankly, am not fully informed about all of that, but I can tell you that a release of refrigerants from these heat pumps has a serious climate change impact. And as this little chart over on the left shows the US as by far the greatest per capita carbon impact, and low income poor world averages are very, very low on that scale in terms of per capita carbon impact. But now we have billions of people who, in order to stay alive, will have to buy air conditioners because of climate change. They might have survived before without them, and now it's a matter of life and death. So as all of those people come online with heat pumps, we're going to have a huge refrigerant problem. And this is a building we worked on in Boston, and we were thrilled to work on as a mass timber project. It's Passive House, it's wonderful. But it was a VRF system, a variable refrigerant flow, with refrigerant pipes going everywhere. And a lot of people will say, well, we're solving that problem because the refrigerants now are no longer 14,800 times as bad as carbon. Now we're down to somewhere around 2,000 times as bad as carbon as a climate impact. And we're even changing. We're doing a switch over to 675 times worse than carbon as a climate change impact. But it's still 675 times as bad as burning fossil fuel. So if you have a large leak, you've undone all the good work of electrifying by releasing that refrigerant. So that's not to say we shouldn't do heat pumps. It's just to say we have to be mindful that there are impacts with every decision we make. I just want to give credit to Ben Rausch of FSI Engineers who created this slide for a presentation we did together. And here's the distribution system with that VRF system in the project in Boston. That's a lot of refrigerant, and that's a lot of climate change. And I've had projects where lightning would strike and you lose it all. We've also had projects where there's just not very good workmanship and you lose it all, or some significant portion of the refrigerant. So no one really knows how much damage has been done, but it's happening. So if we electrify with these systems, we could be running into real problems. Also, as we electrify, total electricity demand goes up, which means we're putting the grid more under stress, and we're going to have to spend about $1.5 to $2 trillion updating the power infrastructure. So electrifying is good, but not if you do it with our current systems and our current approach. So now there are people who are literally debating how wonderful it would be to turn massive amounts of forest into PV solar farms in order to offset our increased energy demand. Now again, why aren't we reducing our energy demand is the question. It's not how much forest do we plow under for solar. So if we have all this solar, the one on the left is not our project. The one on the right is. It's Barry Farm in Washington, D.C. Green roofs over solar panels over green roofs. This building is zero energy for heating, cooling, and hot water. The plug loads are on the tenant, but their basic well-being and survival is accounted for free of charge because we have highly efficient thermal envelope and solar panels and good systems. But if we put all that solar up and the people who run the grid they like to have a nice base load of energy. They don't like large fluctuations because then they have to manage these surges of energy demand and the collapse of energy demand. If we keep putting solar up at the rate we're going, in the middle of the day, which is when the sun is most productive, right? We're hollowing out the grid demand, which is this dotted line, right? Now, if you hollow that out, come the afternoon, I'm assuming you can see my cursor, you have this massive load ramp, which means in the morning, they have to start turning power plants off, and then they have to turn them all back on. And this is really intensive, both in terms of the impacts on the grid and their operations. It's very, very hard to manage. Does that mean solar is the enemy? Absolutely not. Should the grid operators get in the way of solar installation? Absolutely not. But we, on the conservation side, have to understand that solar is not the answer. It's part of an answer. So if we put a battery, and let me be clear, I would never buy a Tesla right now, but if we buy a battery, we can take that surplus energy, put it into the battery, and then release it in the evening, precisely when that load ramp is happening. And then we become good grid citizens, and we're helping the grid perform as it should, as a common resource for all, with less cost. So now we're going to balance how much solar do we put up so that we can still afford some battery and actually balance out those impacts. However, even that solution is basically driving a neo-colonialism in Africa and elsewhere for precious metals to put into these pieces of technology. So is this climate tech, this wicked sexy battery by our friend Elon, is that climate tech? And the answer is, at best, it is a highly conditional assessment of whether that's climate tech or not, because what we're actually experiencing is massive forms of new wage slavery across Africa. And this is particularly in the Republic of the Congo. But in Africa and in Asia, anywhere they can find these rare earth metals, people are being exploited terribly for our convenience and for the very good goal of climate change mitigation, right? But it all has an impact. So Wow, is this climate tech? No, it's colonialism, or maybe it's both. So I go back to my question of what does it mean to first do no harm? So the problem may be in the way we're thinking about technology. We think of a rocket as being super high technology, right? It takes a lot of engineers to make a rocket fly to the moon or Mars. But it's destructive as heck to build a rocket with all of the materials it uses. It is literally destroyed in its use. It destroys the climate while it blasts itself up there. Okay? So it's like on three categories, it's absolutely terrible technology, a rocket, even though we would call it high tech. Whereas there are solutions where you can create generative technologies. How might we do that? First of all, back on the theme of do no harm, is people have known for thousands of years how to limit their heating loads and reduce their cooling loads simply through mindful design. This doesn't cost anything. It helps the climate. It's a generative approach, and it's just a mindset. It does not add more money. So in our building in Washington, D.C., Barry Farm, it's a redevelopment of the first, is actually the first freed Black community, I believe, during Reconstruction, right just in Southeast DC. And so it's being redeveloped. And you can see our shading devices in this central image. And on the left here, these images were from Weinberg Commons, which was done in 2014. So we've been doing this for a little while. On the right, we just have some passion flowers in front of our east window, right? So it's like there are ways to pay attention to how much energy you're harvesting from the sun and make sure you're getting it at the right time and not when you don't want it. So begin with your site orientation and massing, which you already heard, I believe, from Andy Allwine from our team. And if we have a high performance envelope, we can reduce heat loss and we can improve indoor air quality and save a ton of energy. So that's harm reduction. And then if you do that, remember I talked about all the bad things about solar, lots of solar and lots of battery. Well, if you improve your building first, then you're reducing the amount of those new technologies, things that we typically call high tech. With low tech, we're reducing our investment in high tech, which also makes the system much more resilient and robust. So all of these things up to this point, and I'm probably already at time, but all of these things up to this point are ways to sort of unwind this degenerative spiral of conventional construction and development. And we're getting a little bit less bad and a little bit less bad with LEED and green globes and all these like tools. And then if we were to be actually sustainable, we'd be at zero for everything. And that is a huge job. And most projects are nowhere near that. And it's because the systems that we're a part of, we're using the materials that have been invested in through and subsidies for R&D, for research, for extraction, for oil companies. We have all of these products that are made out of oil and that continue the use of oil. And those systems are not likely to want to give up that hold on the market. And so before I was showing charts of how, we have an exponential growth in economic and material economic activity, and you hit your carrying capacity. But our whole economic model is built on perpetual growth. And if any politician says we're going to get anything less than 3%, they're immediately rejected. It can't happen on a finite planet. And so since at least 1972, and really quite a bit before that, we've known that what actually happens is you reach a point where you're drawing down your resources and your exponential growth in population and services and production cause you to hit a limit where you can no longer function and you experience a collapse. And I want to point this out loudly and clearly. Everyone's focus right now is justifiably on increasing efficiency to avoid climate change. However, in the modeling that is done of these systems, of the global economic system, if you give yourself a 200% land yield increase and assume there's no land encroachment, even though you're rapidly building up your population, and you give yourself an annual 4% reduction in emissions and 100% recycling, which we're nowhere near, and accelerated technological improvements, all dedicated to avoiding climate change. If you do all of those things, all you do from this case one is you take our tipping point from about 2020 and you push it off to about 2040. And the economy grows more, things expand more, and the throughput of the economy, the material and economic throughput is higher, and the waste is higher, and you have a larger population and a bigger crash just a little bit later. So you buy yourself 20 years with all of those things, which we're nowhere near. Okay, and we also know that with increase in technology, we've actually seen a net increase in production and throughput and consumption. So if we say, oh, we're 30% more efficient, that tends to actually stimulate more growth because of the way our economic system works, which undoes the 30% savings and actually causes more harm than good. There's an interesting anecdote that we used to burn a lot of wood in Europe. And then when they found coal, massive coal deposits, and figured out how to extract it, then everyone said, oh, we switched from the wood economy to the coal economy. Actually, what happened was they started digging coal and they needed timbers to build the tunnels into the earth to extract the coal. We ended up using just as much wood and all of the energy from the coal. So in other words, efficiency does not mean we're better off. It could mean that we just leverage more destruction. So again, what is climate tech? So if we're going to solve that, if we're going to even answer that question of what is climate tech, we have to understand that we have to think systemically and we have to change the paradigm. The number one thing we have to do is change the paradigm from becoming more efficient, which, as I said, was unwinding this downward spiral of degenerative systems, and start creating generative systems. All right, so how do we do that? We have to think like nature. Nature is diverse, resilient, and abundant, all on its own without any of us messing around with it. And if we do mess around with it, we tend to make it a lot worse. Nature achieves a 2.6% annual increase in biomass and in terms of production every year. And if we were able to stay within that and not poison the planet, maybe we'd have a viable steady state system. All natural systems function within limits, all of them, except ours. And that's why we're going to be in a death spiral. This is the classic oscillation dynamic equilibrium model. Predator-prey relationships, growth, forest fire decay, regrowth. This is a normal, natural oscillation, okay? In all sorts of dynamics. In the one on the right, it's carbon. And the one on the left, it's predator-prey population. But these systems function with no waste. Everything gets turned back into a nutrient and becomes life again. These are generative systems. Now, there's this, I'm not a physicist or I never even got close to physics, honestly, but this is the second law of thermodynamics, which is to say, energy can't be created, it's only changed. Energy matter is changed. But then the second law is every time you change it into something else, there is a loss along that process. So if you look over here on the upper left, we get 2.4 million calories, solar mcals. I think this is perhaps per day. I'm not sure what the time scale is on this. In any case, that gets turned into green plants. And from that 2.4 million, we're down to 800 mcals of available energy in the wood, stored energy in the wood. If that gets turned through a geological process into coal, now we're down to 60. If we then burn it at a power plant, now we're down to 14. If we use that to power our light bulbs, we're down to 1. So there's an exponential decrease in available power the further away from the primary producer of the sun and photosynthesis. So that is to say that the more high tech you use, the least efficient you are in global production terms, in natural terms. So we have to be regenerative. We have to turn this cycle around. We have to get back closer to primary producers. So if we use mass timber, for example, and the forests are sustainably harvested and managed in the way that indigenous populations did, we could have a net increase of growth, get all the wood we need for building, and have a carbon negative footprint. These are all pictures of buildings. Well, one is just a schematic, just sort of a visualization, which may or may not even work, and it has a lot of glass, so it's inherently not efficient, so I'm not actually advocating for that one. But we have things like this school in England, which was built entirely out of straw and wood. This is Eco Cocoon down in the bottom right. They make prefabricated straw panels. The straw every year is pulling carbon down out of the atmosphere. It's being packed into a wall system, and it's a super high performance envelope and very good for air quality and performance. This is hempcrete, which is hemp stalks and lime plaster. This is cork. And if you ever come out, you should come out to our house, Aaron. We have cork insulation on the inside and cladding the exterior of the building. And cork, the tree grows, pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, and then they pull the cork off the tree, but the tree stays alive. They don't kill the tree. And then it pulls more carbon in the atmosphere and makes more cork, and we can use it as insulation. So it's a good example of a carbon negative material. So you can build the same building and have a huge carbon impact, and you can replace materials with closer to primary producer, like nature-based solutions, and you can actually end up making that building a net carbon sink. So we can either be spewing 241 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, or we could be storing 137, building the same building. So we need to find the appropriate technologies to build the same, to meet our needs. So you can get the same comfort and pleasure, or better, for a negative climate impact. In other words, a positive effect. Okay, but in order to do that, you have to have systemic solutions for systemic problems. You have to think at the scale, and this is where in the upper right, you see appropriate tech, appropriate scale, nested and mutually supporting systems. These are all systems thinking concepts. Appropriate scale means you need to understand what the impacts are of anything you use, and if you can bring it from within your bioregion, from within a local economy, you're more likely to be able to understand what those impacts are and mitigate them or reverse them. So now I'm back to the good news, which is that if you do these things, we get energy efficiency, thermal comfort, indoor air quality, health and wellness generally, building durability, and massive cost savings. And they're all flowing from the same strategies, this interlocking set of strategies that we're discussing right now. So we need a healing system where everything we do has a regenerative impact. It needs to repair the damage done to the commons, and we have to remember that the atmosphere and the soil and the air, they are our commons. No one should be allowed to own them, but people are allowed to, in our capitalist, our neoliberal economic capitalist society, we're able to just go and claim something and extract it and send all the bad effects downstream. So we're saying, no, we've got to embrace the whole system and repair, stop doing harm, reuse and restore and repair the commons. And then we have to focus on how, with appropriate scale, appropriate technology, and mutually supportive systems, we can actually build a regenerative system. And so you need to think of all the interconnections between all the disciplines and all the businesses or nonprofits or organizations that might exist in a neighborhood, for example. And this was a project Carrie and I and some other friends put together for a Baltimore City resilient neighborhood concept. All of them are practical. All of them can be done, but we rarely think in terms of a holistic system. So in order to do that, you're going to need regenerative economics, and we're winding down here, which to say we need to start putting values on things that have real value. And at the moment, we're not actually accounting for the damage function of carbon. So we're not valuing the reduction of carbon. So there's no way you're going to get the market to decide that it's worth doing. But if you look at your geological region, which in this case is like, this is geological formations, and you were to overlay it with something like watersheds, and then you could probably add another layer of habitat distribution, you start to understand where your bioregion is and what you can pull out of it without, and then how you nurture it so that you recreate a generative regional system. And this is a new field of economics, and there are new financing mechanisms that are being developed. And if any of us want to have a future for our society, for our kids, for whomever, just because we care, we all need to be starting to decide to use these mechanisms and not rely on the neoclassical capitalist economic market. It has not found the solutions. It has intended to increase harm, and it will not find the solutions. So we have to prioritize low impact, low tech. Climate tech is generally low tech. And natural solutions, weight them heavily towards the primary producers, like our friend Farmer Nell from West Baltimore in the upper left there, and the shading on our windows, relying on plants photosynthesizing to create shade. Don't use a piece of metal, but use a piece of metal if you have to stop yourself from having cooling loads. So you're making all of these judgments. If you do regenerative agriculture, you deepen the root structure in the soil and pull carbon down into the atmosphere, and you can grow food and building materials and build your buildings out of that while composting the waste, even use some of that waste for biofuels. And then maybe we get into larger things like mass timber buildings, which are more extractive and harder to do sustainably, but can be done. Only once we've done all of those things should we even think about using things like concrete or recycled steel or solar panels or heat pumps or batteries. So we've got to change our paradigm to shifting back towards the upper left-hand side of this graphic and the left side of the entropy diagram on the bottom left. And then we have a chance of doing something like this. The only way that the MIT scientists who built that world model in the limits to growth in 1972, the only way they were able to create a soft landing for society rather than a total collapse was by stabilizing the population at 7.5 billion, which means 2 children per couple on average. We had to have a technological increase as before, but we needed to use that technology to abate pollution, increase land yields, and protect renewable resources, things like aquifers and the atmosphere, from erosion. And we needed to reduce our industrial output to enough to make people live with dignity and happiness, which happened to be 10% higher than 2000 levels, right? The year 2000, we were all living pretty darn well. And you can get 10% more. And if you distribute it more equally, everyone could live with dignity and safety. In other words, what is enough? We have to understand what is enough, and we have to say that it's okay to only take enough, because if we don't, we're doomed to collapse. So it turns out that what is technology, making it the lowest impact, and how do we use it are the most important questions. And can we decide that there is such a thing as enough, which is to say not doing something just because it can be done. We do not need to go to Mars. That will only exacerbate the problem. We need to reduce our technological striving in the conventional sense of high technology. Now, this does not happen through a market system without human hearts and minds deciding it should be so. Back in 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. gave the speech at the Riverside Church, breaking with LBJ and saying the Vietnam War is just wrong, because he was able to clearly say, I'm looking at the situation, I have a right view of the situation. We are sending our people to go kill other people in a way that cannot possibly be justified. And so he spoke up and spoke out against the Vietnam War. But what he said was, in that speech, was the world demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. We have to be ready to turn sharply away from our present ways. So are we as a culture capable of not doing things? Do we not genomically engineer ourselves? Do we not continue to geoengineer the planet in a destructive way? Do we not choose to use AI because it's ramping up energy use to such a degree that now they have to bring whole new nuclear power stations online to support it? What can we choose not to do? It takes courage to decide to reduce yourself, in a sense, right? So in other words, from my perspective, the real climate tech we need to be talking about is moral leadership. More deep, systemic understandings of the world we're in and how it works, and applying our very best moral leadership, which does tend to surface from time to time. So, could we ever be happy with enough? Limiting ourselves is not how Americans tend to think. But I say yes, because enough can be unbelievably beautiful and rewarding. And it's not just the MLKs of the world, the figurehead leaders. There are also community leaders locally. Every one of these people is someone I've had the privilege of meeting over the years and being, oh my gosh, they're finding the solution in reducing harm and creating generative benefits. Candace Chance in the bottom left from VPI firm, Brenda White from the Allen AME Church, Melanie Thomas and Rachel Carson from SBCLT, Farmer Nell from, he has his City Weeds program, and Eric Jackson from Black Yield Institute. And there are many, many more. You said you spoke to Requity the other day. Michael Rosenband from Requity is another one of these people. There are remarkable, many, many remarkable human beings working within miles of where I stand right now, within just a couple miles, that are doing the regenerative work. It's time to get together, leverage all of our collective wisdom and leadership, and act together. And that's why I would say none of those people coming down from MLK to our community level, right? There can only be one MLK because he's the figurehead. But then there needs to be a distributed group of leaders, and they can only do their work if you have this, which is community. And so our friend Candace Chance, who was on the prior slides, wrote some grants with us, and she kept on saying, diversity and inclusion is not a checkbox. Diversity and inclusion can equate to democracy and collective action and collective wisdom. And so community is the ultimate climate tech. And in my opinion, the only one that will allow us to leverage a holistic, community-based view, systemic view, and the moral leadership to do what is needed. Human discernment, compassion, love. These are climate tech, and they're the ones that are in shortest supply right now. So that's it, Aaron. Thank you.
Oh, this was great, Michael. Thank you so much. Folks, you got a graduate level presentation, dissertation here, asked and answered in regards to what climate tech is and what it isn't. And you even learned about the law of thermodynamics. How about that? Thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciated meeting you in my hometown of Syracuse, New York, a few years back.
Yep.
We both happened to be attending the USGBC Green Buildings Conference in Syracuse, which was at the Syracuse Marriott, which unfortunately had the worst air quality.
Yes.
I take my air quality monitors with me everywhere, and it was just off the charts. Not good in that building, unfortunately.
Yep.
But one of the things that I think I learned there, or time around there, was the cheapest kilowatt hour is the kilowatt hour not used.
Yep.
And the thesis of last year's Baltimore Climate Tech Plus conference, last year we focused on, the Maryland Climate Solutions Now Act, building energy
Mhm.
performance standards, the most aggressive climate law in the country.
Right.
That at that time, and I think still today, most building owners and corporate tenants don't even know exists. And so we had about 47 subject matter experts last year talk about, green leasing and all different aspects of decarbonization kind of in the office sector. And so this year we wanted to focus on healthy, smart, high performance homes.
Yep.
Our thesis last year and this year is, the building is the database, right?
Mm.
And the data is the new gold, right? I only wish that, I mean, the only piece of technology that I have in my home that tells me how my home is performing is my thermostat.
Hmm.
That's it. I can go on an app and I can turn my thermostat up and down.
Yep.
But when I go into my car, that I paid a quarter of the price for, I've got all the dials in the dashboard on my dashboard. I know how much fuel I have. It even tells me if my air quality is not good or if I'm, getting my cognitive abilities are not doing well. Um, you know, how come our homes don't have? I think if they had more data, we'd be able to know if we're kind of getting what we paid for. We'd be able to validate air quality, energy usage, thermal
Yep.
health. But the lack of data in the most expensive asset that we'll ever own, I think is a challenge as well. How do you feel about that?
That is very well put. And I will confess that because I've been so focused on building envelope and reducing harm in terms of material sourcing and such, I'm not an expert on building monitoring systems. But and the thing behind us, this house here, we did a deep energy retrofit on it. We're pretty close to zero energy with all the materials we're talking about and things we're trying not to use or not included, and all of that has been done here. But there's an additional layer of cost which could be an effective building monitoring system. Now I can look at our energy bills
Right.
and I can look at the dashboard for the solar production and I know how much on net on it, average annual net usage, right? Like we can do that. We can look at it month to month. We can look at it hour to hour. But so we might have that, but we don't have it in one place where we can do, as you say, have a dashboard that says, oh yeah, I'm using this much. What is that coming from, and how could I curtail that, and not curtail it in a way that limits my comfort?
Right.
Like if the power grid is under pressure and we have a super insulated envelope and we can float through the load ramp, we can export our power to the grid at that time and do a service to our community and stay perfectly comfortable. And then, oh,
Mhm.
yeah, well, let's choose to run the laundry and the dishwasher tonight when the rates are low and the extra heat isn't driving anything.
Or AI made that choice for you.
Or a yes, a technological sort of a computer can make that choice for you.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Now, if we got so computerized that everything was supposedly smart and all that data was driving server farms and we were having negative impacts, then I got a problem with it.
Right.
But my guess is a lot of this stuff is low voltage little clips saying, "Oh yeah, we're pulling this," and then
Right.
we look at. I spend my time, much to my chagrin, on the computer all day and looking at things on the internet to research. And again, much to my chagrin, I'd rather not. And I know there's an energy impact, but it's probably less than driving to an office 30 miles away.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I'm sort of I'm trying to make a guess about you know what the net benefits are. Now, if we were to have a low voltage system monitoring our homes and giving us useful information to reduce large scale, impacts, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's hard, and I do think those systems are increasingly available. And since I started working on the less in the weed size of our business, like I'm less sort of like running the models and
Hmm.
asking, and finding those technologies myself. But
Hmm.
yes, those things do exist and they should be used.
Yeah, I mean, the building is generating data. It's just are we harnessing it, right?
That's right.
And
Yep.
and unfortunately, you and I are both in an industry that unfortunately is the least digitized, declining in productivity and can have a strong resistance to change. I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir on that one, but where where does the where do the social determinants of health kind of play into your thesis and kind of how you think about the world?
Yeah. So I tried to touch on that a little bit, but just to recap, we have a friend named Julie Klump from Preservation of Affordable Housing, an affordable housing developer that is really very committed to energy efficiency, climate, and also social well-being generally.
Mhm, mhm,
And
mhm.
so they provide a lot of resident support services and education and all manner of ways of trying to improve people's lives in the buildings in the communities they build. Julia is fond of telling me the story of how they built a new project on Cape Cod, and it was Passive House. And she was like, okay, what are the energy bills looking like? Like, how's things going? And the operations people are like, yeah, it saves money. That's great. Okay. And in the upper left-hand picture here is Guilford Knolls 3. That was the first Passive House senior facility in New Hampshire, and we were the Passive House consultants on that. And I was asked to go and speak at a New Hampshire forum on energy efficiency and affordable housing. And so I did, and we showed up with the developer, who's another developer other than Julie, but showed up, and we were in front of the audience, and the audience asked, like, well, how's it performing? How, like, what's the energy, all this stuff. And they wanted the technical stuff. And she
Mhm.
said, look, ask Michael. All I know is my seniors are smiling and they're comfortable.
Right.
And they're not asking us to come in and adjust the thermostat. Well, turns out that if you have a warm interior surface temperature, you don't feel the radiant heat loss from your skin. If that warm interior surface temperature, because of the insulation in the wall, if it's warmer, the air near it doesn't get more dense and fall and create a convection loop. And,
Mhm.
so there are all these things other than the thermostat. You said, oh, the only data collection I have is my thermostat. Well, the thermostat doesn't even tell you about relative humidity, which impacts your comfort just as much. It
Exactly.
doesn't inform you about convection loops and air velocity in your space at all. And it doesn't tell you what the mean radiant surface temperature of the wall is. Each of those things could be more important than the set point on your thermostat.
Hmm. Hmm.
So in the part of our house that we were able to deep energy retrofit with thicker walls, you can tell it's more
Hmm.
comfortable. Now,
Hmm.
getting back to your point, social determinants of health. Comfort is great, okay? But then I also showed that thing about putting the vapor control layer in the right place in the wall and avoiding the condensation on the first condensation plane, which is, say, the first hard sort of vapor opaque surface that the
And
vapor.
you got to that humidity sweet point of 40 to 50, right?
Right.
I've heard 47 being the magic number, but I did notice that on your slide that yeah.
Yes, we're between like passive houses go between 40 and 60 and just
Hmm.
very comfortably all year long,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they also have ERVs, which I didn't get to because Andy was doing the Passive House Basics presentation, but
Yeah.
energy recovery ventilators transfer both heat and humidity. So they retain more humidity in the winter, so you don't get dry nasal passages, and they reject the humidity in the summer. And they also capture 80+% of the heat that would be lost to ventilation. So those are two ways in which we improve comfort and air quality. Now, the fact that behind the drywall, there's this wall system which could be growing mold, and we eliminate that possibility, that
Hmm.
becomes a very powerful social determinant of health.
Mhm,
right?
mhm, mhm.
So if you don't have mold and your kid isn't being rushed to the emergency room and you can have a job and keep it because they're not firing you for being absent for a medical emergency, and your kid can stay in school and be more productive and healthy, and all of those good things are happening, your whole potential of family wealth generation is improved,
Right.
as well as stress. I mean, I'm just going to speak from the position of a person who's feeling a little bit of a stress right now. It really impairs my cognitive function and
Mhm,
it makes me feel miserable.
mhm, mhm,
You relieve some of that stress with no energy bill. And so now we've improved their air quality, which means their productivity, which means their overall productivity and happiness, and then their less stress means they're even more happy. And sort of like you're starting to create that generative cycle, not
mhm,
to mention the fact that none of these buildings you see have any combustion appliances.
mhm,
No one is burning a fuel, and
mhm,
that means there's less NIOx, less CO2, like less. All these things could cause your air quality in your home and in your surrounding community to be compromised.
mhm,
We know that kids growing up in neighborhoods near highways with lots of noise, it raises their stress levels and the blood pressure levels, and the diesel and the gasoline particulate emissions are poisoning them.
Brake dust, tire dust. Yeah.
Brake dust, tire dust, like all of that stuff, right? So if we're able to take all of the combustion out of the neighborhood with respect to the buildings,
Mhm,
we have just cleaned the air. If we could use green infrastructure like trees and trellises for shading, they would filter the air. And when it
mhm,
rains, if we can capture that water and treat it locally with, bioretention systems, we're even saving the bay, right?
mhm.
Um, so there are a lot of social determinants of health being affected with that. I had that synergies chart. It's like, oh, you get the
Yeah.
energy efficiency. It's so easy to just put that up and be done with it. But the
Mhm,
the effect is so incredibly powerful,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
So I think those are the primary ones. It's indoor air quality through better systems,
Yep.
avoiding mold,
Yep.
not using combustion. Um, but then there's one more I want to talk about.
Mm.
Our buildings are toxic as hell.
They were not built for human health and well-being.
They are not built for human health and well-being. And I will challenge you to find an affordable housing project that does not use a boatload of vinyl in the floors
Mhm,
and in various other places around the building.
mhm,
Surfaces. How many plastics are there? We know for a fact that Cancer Alley is real. Petroleum products being extracted near lower income neighborhoods, primarily people of color, getting wicked high cancer rates,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And they're forgotten and abandoned and
mhm,
neglected.
mhm,
And those products are being used by people who are trying their very, very best to do affordable housing,
mhm.
right? And so they choose this cheaper material for the floor, the luxury vinyl tile,
Formaldehyde.
that and formaldehyde in cabinets and such. Luxury vinyl tile is one of the absolute worst, most toxic materials you could put anywhere near a human being. And it's in every affordable housing project. I'm sure there are exceptions to prove the rule, but they are just that, they're exceptions. And I'm not saying that those affordable housing developers are bad people. I'm saying that they are working within a very tight market with limited incentives, and all affordable housing is done with subsidy. Nothing, the market does not provide housing affordably, right? The market-based solutions we hear about, they can work. They need to be a part of the solution, but they are not, as our socioeconomic religion of pull yourself up by your bootstrapsism tells
Mhm,
us, the market is the
mhm,
solution to everything. Markets
mhm,
regularly fail. And one of the ways they fail is helping us avoid cancer through material choices, having enough health care when we do get sick, and childcare. Anything that seems to be for the general welfare is ignored generally by the market unless someone can make a short-term profit off it. So These folks in the affordable housing industry, they're good folks. They choose vinyl because it's less expensive. They can get more affordable housing units. We have to take a systemic approach, put the value, as you said, earlier, you were telling me about some of the other people that have presented, and one of them was health organizations using health outcomes to help finance better housing. Well,
National Center for Healthy Housing. Yeah.
okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Get the vinyl out of the buildings and off of the buildings. Use insulation. Put the vapor control layer in the right place. I once had a conversation with someone from Enterprise Community Partners, a very wonderful person, and we got laughing because we were talking about bathroom fans as a social justice issue. And like, why is that? Why is it funny, or why is it even a conversation? Because if you pull air out of the bathroom with a fan that's just taking the air outside, right? We know that nature abhors a vacuum. The air is going to come back in from somewhere. Where's it going to come in through? It's going to come in through interstitial cracks in the building assembly, which is not well built, and it's going to come past the mold and the mouse turds and everything else.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the radon that it's bringing in and a high
The
radon area.
radon, like we're sucking toxins into our houses because of a ventilation code that says you must have X amount of CFM pulled from the space. Now, that may be true. We need to ventilate the space, but only if you use the balanced recovery ventilation do you actually do it in a way that is not harmful to either planet or persons.
So, gosh, I've got more questions when we have time. We have to wrap up. I wanted to talk to you about Candace. I've become a new Candace Chance fan. I
Yeah,
recently met her. I'm a huge fan. She was one of our presenters as well, and she educated me on regenerative economics. I was not familiar with the term, but she kind of broke it down for me, sent me some resources. Of course, you two have been having apparently lots of conversations about that, so I'm glad that I'm getting caught up to speed. Um, I also wanted to ask you about Passive House, being a performance-based design standard versus a performance-based standard versus a design standard. But it sounded
yep,
to me as though the performance part happened with the air blower test
yep,
prior to occupancy, but what about 3 years down the road? Is
yeah.
anybody measuring performance at that part? And if not, then how is it considered a performance-based standard?
Yeah, that's an excellent, excellent question. What they mean by that, I'll try to be brief, is, they're pegging specific energy metrics: heating energy demand per year, cooling energy demand per year, heating load in a given hour per year, cooling load, and then overall energy per person. Those are the metrics. And the last metric, which is one for testing out, is the 0.06 CFM per square foot of envelope, which is a very, very, very airtight building. We
And
still
that's
have the
but
windows,
but
but
that's prior to occupancy. What about 3 years down the road? Is
yep,
it
that's
still being
prior to
tracked?
occupancy.
Is it
So
still
what
being
I
tracked
just
at three? Okay.
yeah, what I just described was sort of the setup supposedly for success, right?
Got it. Got it.
The design metrics set you up so the building envelope is properly designed and it will be airtight. And presumably that's a durable airtight layer. Now there are more and less durable ways of doing that, right? And so we like to put the primary airtight control layer somewhere in the middle of the wall so you can't punch it full of holes every time you hang a picture, etc. Right? Now, Passive House does not require monitoring. And I will tell you that I have suggested monitoring on every project I've ever done, and no one has wanted to spend the money. So where we have seen monitoring, it was where we got a subsidy to put in the monitoring equipment, and guess what? It really helped us. But if the owner is being asked, they tend not to do it.
Mm,
Now, if you could make the case, and maybe you can help me with this, that, oh yeah, you're going to save more over the long term by spending this $3,000 right now, or fine, we should work together as a community, and some in our community already have probably found this answer: the lowest cost, highest yield, data to
hmm
cost balance, to
hmm
give us the critical information we need. We don't need to monitor everything.
Yeah.
We need to monitor general plug loads, heating and cooling, humidity, temperature,
Air
that sort of
air exchange rate.
air exchange rate, that sort
Sure.
of thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the contaminants. We want to make sure we don't have a lot of
Right.
contaminants.
Exactly. Exactly.
So we need that. And the answer to your question is yes, we should have it. It's not a requirement of the standard because it was seen as an obstacle of implementation. And if you do these things right, you shouldn't actually need it. You should just be able to live carefree off grid kind of thing. That's sort of the idea, right? The reality is that the people who have done it typically are the design build people who know that they're going to be responsible and know where to design, in their design, where to put the monitors, and they have control over the budget. So they do it, and guess what? They get a great amount of data, and they can spot diagnostic problems before the owner does.
I think that's where Reset and Passive House are the perfect marriage, because
Yeah,
Reset is the performance-based, third-party validated data
right.
verifier that really helps validate that homeowners got what they paid for,
Yeah.
or
And
building owners.
I think what we need to do is we need to get this stuff enough into the industry that everything we try to do that's good is not another expensive certification.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I would love to talk to you about that at some other occasion to
I,
like,
we didn't even get the chance to talk about offsite construction. Oh my God, I got so much I want to talk about. But Michael, I want to thank you for your time, your subject matter expertise. You have been great. We got a college level dissertation today. This has been awesome. Thank you so much.
it's absolutely my pleasure, Aaron. And I really look forward. Let's have another conversation about regenerative economics because we're doing a deep dive. The offsite fabrication is just like the answer to the other problem, the other issues. It can be a really good technology or a really destructive one, depends on how you do it. So let's leave it at let's take that a commitment to that systemic view for every decision we make, and then and we're gonna be okay.
Sounds good, man. I appreciate you.
All right.
All
I
right, have a good one.
appreciate you. Thank you for putting this together, and I really look forward to seeing the other content.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.